Hello. So today I will be talking about Anthony Howell's book from page 71 to 86, and that was also chapter 5, which is called Inconsistency, Catastrophe, and Surprise. So even though it's titled that, the main topic is inconsistency, and catastrophe and surprise are seen as a subset of inconsistency, as Anthony Howell at least argues it. So most of the article is him showing what inconsistency is, but uses the idea of repetition to argue against what the opposites are. Um, so he kind of denotes it in, not kind of, he denotes it in 71. Inconsistency is the third primary of action. So I guess my first question are, what are the first and second primary of action? I'm guessing one of them is repetition and the other is inconsistency. So what's the other one? Um, but it's one of the fundamental poles of action, and and then it is seen that pure inconsistency is impossible. That's all on page 72. And he gives examples of inconsistency. He starts off with example of inconsistency with going to visit a client and then seeing another guy who was also in a mental hospital, I guess. Um, but he talks about how consistency um, is like not really seen in psychoanalysis as much. It's seen more in performance, but he tries to also define it in psychoanalysis as well. But he starts off with performance and just talks about the generation of inconsistent actions by suggestion and generation of inconsistent action by task, not taste. And that's from page 72 to page 74. And then talks about the idea of consistent inconsistencies as well, and then goal bending. None of these really made sense to me. He kind of gave activities with each one of them, I guess, to give us examples of what it means. But again, I couldn't really understand. But what I'll try to say is, like, for generation of inconsistent actions by task, it talked about the idea of, like, taking an object that you would use, like a book, and then talking about the verbs that go with that, but then using it on a banana, for say, or a chair. That you read the banana, you throw away the banana, you quote the banana, like that. And consistent inconsistencies were the idea of performance art, basically, that even though these all seem like random acts being put, that they're actually planned. Um, and then he talks a lot about the opposites of what repetition is and what inconsistency is. So he talks about on page 76, if repetition is a comfort, inconsistency is not. And that is all about inconsistency in psychoanalysis. And then it's talking about how that repetition obviously is the opposite of inconsistency, where inconsistency creates an event punctuating time. It connects with sin of pride, it elevates the unique, and it's a delusion of grandeur or genius. And it constitutes a refusal of coordination, where coordination is what repetition is. So then there's, of course, the ideas of surprise and catastrophe. He talks a little bit about surprise more than catastrophe. So he talks about how a surprise. Well, first he talks about how inconsistent incidents. He says incidents has characteristics of positive/negative dyads. That's on page 80. Um, which then he kind of transfers that into surprises, and how um, a surprise is a defeat of expectations. He also says that on page 80, and that they're like ruptures, so it's lifting from the predictable into the unpredictable, so that you're taking your and he kind of so he uses the idea of like trauma, of which I didn't really find all that wonderful, that he kind of was like, and used like that you don't that you're comfortable with family, so and they do things that will traumatize you basically. um and then he talked about catastrophe for like a really brief moment there. And I believe that what he was saying basically was that catastrophes come from inconsistencies, but um, that they kind of disturb. So he talks about like Oedipus or X and Hercules, which is odd because I feel like those aren't performance art, so it wasn't helpful for me to figure it out through performance art. Those are plays, and it's almost like a snowball effect, almost like the in catastrophes of inconsistency, that it's like one thing happens and then it so he talks about also a Goldie Hawn piece. It was just like I didn't know what Anthony Howell was talking about. But then the last thing that I think was most important, I think that he goes back into inconsistency and repetition, and he talks about how inconsistency may be a single event which disturbs slash fundamentally alters that entire field on page 83, but he also says that opposites become as much a part of the pattern as similarities on page 84. And I think that my question would be is how can how can it possibly be a pattern of inconsistencies or a single event? So yeah, thanks Howell for confusing me.